Parliamentary, I'll ask the honourable member to rephrase the question.
Question period. See it on CPAC.
Hi, welcome to Beyond Politics. I'm Catherine Clark. Toronto Conservative MP Bernard Trottier was a page in the House of Commons before he ever ended up back here as a Member of Parliament. He grew up in a small, francophone, rural Alberta town where his dad was the local doctor and his mother was an artist. He ended up in Toronto for work. And in the last election, he defeated none other than former Liberal leader Michael Ignatieff and ending up back in Ottawa. Bernard Trottier joins me now to talk all about his life beyond politics. Bernard Trottier, welcome to Beyond Politics. It's great to have you here.
Delighted to be here.
Now, I usually start by reflecting on someone's childhood and, how they got to where they are, and I promise I will do that with you. But here is what I'm going to ask first, because I'm fascinated by it. You ran and you defeated a sitting Liberal leader.
In Toronto.
In Toronto. When you threw your hat into the ring, did you expect to win?
I can't say I expected to, but we knew, and this is consulting with my team and my wife, of course, that this is eminently doable. I'd been fighting in that riding on behalf of others in 2004, in 2006, in 2008, and always just falling a few thousand votes short. So we knew it was eminently doable, and so it's just a question of putting together a plan and putting together a team, having the resources in place. So we knew we could win.
Right.
And then as things evolved over the course of a year and a half, as I was campaigning, it got better and better all the time. So it was, not a big surprise. And at the end of the day, we had a lot of research that supported our conviction that we could win, looking at those places where we can get votes. And so come election day, people asked me, was I terribly surprised? And I said, I actually wasn't. We really expected that we could really put up a good fight, and then ultimately with things that happened nationally and whatever we did locally, things worked out for the best for us.
Some people who become candidates in ridings that are not always likely to swing their way are referred to as sacrificial land candidates, but you didn't feel like you were one of those then. You felt like you had a pretty...
I didn't feel that, and in a way I didn't care. Winning locally wasn't the most important thing for me.
Interesting.
I just wanted to make sure that we put on a good show in the sense that we presented the party very well in a very important riding in Toronto. And the more important thing for me is just having the government that we wanted. I would have been equally happy, honestly, to have a majority government, and if I didn't win my seat.
Really?
I would have been equally happy. I'd pursue my career, spend more time with my family, we'd have good government. That was more important than actually winning my own seat.
Are you happy you won?
I am, and I'm delighted to do this kind of work.
Yeah.
It's something that is a passion, something I did more on a weekends and evenings kind of basis for several years. I had a full-time career and a full-time family, and this is something whenever I could that interested me so much. My wife called it an interesting hobby. It drive her crazy that I'd be spending all this time evenings and weekends, but it's something that I just love to do.
Well, she must be so happy now.
Well, and so I'm away, and she's a professional, and she's working full time, and so she has to spend a lot more time with family. My children are 11 and 10,
right,
and so they're a little bit more independent. This would have been much more difficult to do this kind of thing with her, say 5 or 6 years ago, but they can do things on their own now. They've got a little after school, part-time job delivering newspapers and those kinds of things. They can let themselves in with their own key. So that kind of level of independence that they have makes it a little bit doable on the family side. And there are some parts of this job where you do spend a lot of time at home in the riding. The house actually sits 26 to 28 weeks of the year.
Right.
Those other weeks of the year, I basically live in the riding. I don't tend to take off because I'm looking forward to actually spending time with my family, and I'm not going to pull them out of school and so on and do any kinds of travel. So that kind of balance actually finds itself, and the timing was really right for us as a family.
Do you find that even when you're at home, though, in the riding, that you have time to be down, to just be with your family and to chill out, for lack of a better term?
Well, I make the time.
Yeah.
And I get invited to a lot of events in the riding and in Toronto and the GTA in particular. And I'll phone people up who invite me to certain things, and I'll just say, look, I've got some family commitments on, say, a Friday night, and they understand. They're actually very, they appreciate the fact that I just call them to turn down an invitation to something. And the fact that I mention to them that my family's a priority, they're okay with that.
Sure.
I think they're just so, you have to, one can commit, and there's some colleagues of mine in my caucus, and I'm sure in the other parties, where some people say they'll talk about doing 10 events on a weekend.
Right.
And I just won't do that. I need to spend some time with my family. It's such an important time in their lives that I need to do that. Having said that, where it really makes some sense and it's important, I'll make that effort when I have some time to spend some time with community organizations, and also even get involved in some of the individual one-on-one casework and meet people. They'll call me and want to get together in the office, or even for lunch or breakfast or something like that, and that's really important to do.
Yeah. Do you take your kids with you to political stuff ever? Do they have an interest in doing it too?
Only if it's something that'll captivate their interest.
Right.
I've taken to some events where it'll be a couple of hours of long-winded political speeches in a language that they don't speak.
Sure.
They speak English and French, and
you represent a diverse riding.
Very diverse,
right.
And communities from Eastern Europe and South Asia and where people are first generation in many cases, and these are direct immigrants from other parts of the world, and so they're fiercely proud of their culture, and they're dealing with some of the things that I guess I'd call myself a francophone. Living outside of or in a minority situation, and I have a desire to transmit my culture, my language to my children, and they have that same desire, and so they're very fiercely proud of their culture, and so they have their community organizations, their churches, their cultural groups, and they want to showcase that, and I'm happy to participate in some of the things that they do and listen to their concerns. They're not fighting for things the same way a francophone group were. Sometimes they're actually concerned about the situation back home in the country that they come from. And that's, I guess, one of the surprises for me to some extent is the extent to which I'm getting involved in some of these foreign relations kinds of things, in that we actually have an influence even as a backbench MP.
Right.
That I'll say certain things in the House of Commons, and it'll be a 1-minute clip on a video clip, and I'll email that to a concerned constituent, and they'll think the world of that, and they'll send that to people in their country, and they mention how this actually reverberates in some distant part of the world. So, that
must be a really quite incredible feeling too.
Yeah, and I think it's something that, I suppose I could do that same kind of thing as a private citizen and do a YouTube video, but it just doesn't.
Probably not.
It doesn't carry as much weight.
Because there's still a respect, both here and certainly abroad, for someone who holds elected office, who is taking an interest in an issue that does not necessarily even directly impact them. It impacts the constituent, but if they're sending that back home and it's showing to their family and friends back home that an elected representative here in Canada is standing up for their cause.
Yeah, and I think it's the kind of thing that maybe 15 years ago, before wide use of the internet around the world, it would have been difficult to have that kind of impact. I suppose you can write a letter and that could be photocopied in fact, but it just doesn't have that immediacy that it has now. And I think also just the kind of the hotter media of a video, and that kind of thing actually tends to transmit itself around the world very quickly. I've had some enormous feedback on things that I've done. So it's one of the surprises for me. Obviously I'm fighting primarily for the people of the Etobicoke-Lakeshore, but still we're part of a global community, and I want to help make things better in other parts of the world where they don't have the same things that we really take for granted around freedom and human rights and democracy.
Right.
So that's an important thing that I focus on as an MP.
You mentioned about being able to take a clip and send it somewhere now, send it halfway around the world or all the way around the world, frankly, and to make an impact. Do you find, being someone of a younger generation who's versed in new technology and who uses it daily, and for whom it's just basically normal, do you find that coming to the House of Commons that it's also a modern place, or was it a bit of a shock when you got there to realize that?
No, I think it's modern enough there's a certain amount of judgment you have to use. Certain types of web, what we'd call 2.0 interactive types of media don't make sense for certain types of communications with people. There's an assumption that some people have, maybe if they come from the business world, that all communications happens via email. And, I deal with a lot of constituents who actually don't have access to email, for example. So you need to make that extra effort to use other means, whether it's face-to-face, having a town hall meeting in a certain part of the riding, for example, or traditional paper-based communications. You need to make that effort. And then you have to think of an overall communication strategy that implements some of the more interactive or social media and electronic communications with the traditional things. Parliamentarians are pretty quick to adapt. They're generally in the business of marketing their party and themselves, and so they use the tools that are available to them.
Yeah.
It's one of the difference, I guess, in terms of I come from a business background,
right.
And so if you think about
with IBM, is that right?
Yeah, a number of different places. Most recently with IBM,
right.
And so I lived and breathed the world of technology, and more in a business context. I worked with the business consulting arm of that, and we used to think about what's the appropriate application of technology to solve business problems, i.e., how do you grow revenue, how do you reduce costs, how do you increase your profitability, how do you increase your market share, those kinds of things. So I think some of that thinking is helpful for politicians, but you've got to be careful at the same time. I have to think about at a certain level, I was elected by less than half of the people in my constituency, and that's just a reality of our political system. And so
that's how the Prime Minister gets elected too.
That's how the Prime Minister gets elected, and God bless our Westminster system that we inherited. I'm actually a firm supporter of our system.
Because you're in the governing party.
Of course, the governing party always blesses the system that exists. But I think it actually, thinking longer term, it actually is a good system. There's a certain amount of stability that we have in this country. It's one of the oldest democracies in the world now. We don't have an election every single year, even though we had a little bit of that for a period of time. But I do think that we've got that right balance between the different voices being heard in our parliamentary system with a certain amount of accountability and direction that our form of government provides. I compare it, I'm sure a lot of Canadians do compare it to the American system, where it's not clear who's accountable for delivering which results at any given time, whether it's the President or it's the House of Representatives or the Senate.
Yeah.
And in our system, it's clear who the government is. If things go well, this is the government that should take some credit for it. If things go badly, it's
the opposition's fault.
Should be the opposition. Well, I suppose that one would want to spin it that way, but no, it's not really that way. I mean, things happen under a certain government, and that government, it's pretty clear who's in charge.
Right.
And I like that system.
Well, there's clarity. That's good news.
For now.
Yeah. Okay, let's go back to where we normally start about childhood, because you mentioned your francophone community. Yeah. And I think that most people are probably not aware, your constituents probably are, but Canadians are probably not aware that though you represent a Toronto riding, you were actually born in a small francophone community in Alberta.
That's right. I'm a country boy. Deep down in my roots, I grew up in St. Paul, Alberta, which is a community in northeastern Alberta, northeast of Edmonton, and small town, about 5,000 people. Francophone to the extent that it was historically the original settlers of that area were all French-speaking.
Right. Up
until the 1930s, really, French was the main language spoken in the streets of that town.
Yeah.
Over time, people from other linguistic groups did settle there. So a large Ukrainian community, large Cree community, a number of Indian reservations around that community also. So in my school upbringing, we had our public school system was French-speaking.
Right.
There was a separate English-speaking school system, but the majority were French speakers. And so that was kind of the norm. Having said that, everybody spoke English. It's not like it was an island of francophonie in Alberta. But I was always delighted to live there.
How did you end up living there? I mean, how did your parents? My
mother was actually born there. Her father was he settled in that area around the turn of the century from the Gaspé. Sorry, not from the Gaspé, from the Beauce region.
Yeah.
And then just people just settled there. My father was Franco-Manitoban, and he was a doctor. And after he graduated from medical school, after serving his time in the RCAF. He was looking for a place to set up a medical practice, and his brother was an RCMP officer, And his brother mentioned that there was a need for a doctor in that community, so he moved to St. Paul.
Wow.
And he lived there his whole life, and he did everything as a general practitioner.
Right. He was a surgeon.
A surgeon also.
Yeah.
So some kid would have an accident on the farm, and he'd have to perform surgery. He'd deliver babies. He would patch people up all the time, and he had to do everything. And we really was very appreciated because a smaller community like that always had a hard time hanging on to their doctors. Nothing has changed.
Yeah.
I suppose whatever thus in this country in terms of rural doctors. And so every Christmas there would be a parade of people at our house offering gifts of appreciation, even though he was just doing his job as a doctor. And there were typically 3 or 4 doctors for quite a large region of about 15 or 20,000 people. So always very busy, and having to work an on-call weekend, basically 1 out of every 3 weekends for years and years.
How do you remember that as a child?
I just remember him basically spending entire weekends on the couch. The phone would ring, and he would put on his shoes and go to the hospital and deal with some emergency, or maybe it was delivering a baby or something like that. So just very, very dedicated, and he'd always have his black satchel with him.
Wherever he went?
Yeah, just about. You'd be going on a hunting trip, for example, and you'd bring a satchel with him just in case there'd be something that would come up if somebody could track him down somehow. This was, of course, before the age of beepers and cell phones even, but this is something you just had to do as a doctor. It was just expected.
But what about his family too? Was there ever a resentment of the fact that his career of choice kept him so busy all the time?
He was,
or even of the community that demanded so much or needed so much from him.
He was one that he did strike a balance, though. I mean, he was always he'd make sure to be home for dinner. He was always there. So it was always. I guess the side of my father that I always admire wasn't so much the medical side of him. It was just more his way of thinking. He was educated by Jesuits at St. Boniface College, so he always had a very Jesuitical kind of manner. Would always think before talking. He'd discuss a problem and he'd just reflect on it, and sometimes he'd come back with a response a day or two later. That was just his way. And somebody who studied Latin and Greek and did his philosophy exams in Greek. I like to think that I inherited some of that thoughtfulness in his way of thinking, and that whenever he'd make a pronouncement at the dinner table, that it was always after a lot of reflection.
It was carefully considered.
Yeah.
He wasn't just kind of spilling out words.
Yeah, and in a way he was maybe to the point of being overly quiet. Like you'd just be listening to something, and then he would, you'd expect him to respond to it, and it would usually take him a while to come up with his thought-out response. My mother, on the other hand, she was the real talkative one in the household, and so she was always filling in any gaps in the conversation.
Maybe that's why he didn't need to talk so much.
That's right. Yeah.
Tell me about your mom, because I understand she was an artist.
She's an artist, yeah. I guess she still is.
Still
you would say,
artist?
yeah. She was a sculptor. She does more painting now, and I actually enjoyed her painting. And I own a lot of her paintings, own some of her sculptures, and so it's just something that she took up. She was never really formally trained. It's just something that she embraced as a young woman, and she had a lot of talent for it. And so the basement of our house was transformed into a gallery, and people would come by all the time and buy her artwork.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so she would display her works at various shows, and there's a gallery in the museum in St. Paul. It was named for her. Hopefully, she's since moved away from that town. She lives in St. Albert, Alberta now, but it was named after her. And she was always just very involved in the community. Like anybody needed a volunteer, whether it was it was called the Mentally Handicapped Association, or she'd be volunteering at the seniors, and she was just always somebody who just plunged into helping out and just never really questioned the need, just something that needed to be done. It's something you do in a smaller community. Were
people accepting of her career, of the work she did as an artist, or did people think that was an unusual choice as a career?
No, I think it's a fairly, I guess compared to but a fairly artistic community. I think there were quite a number of people who were engaged in art.
Right.
There was, a visual arts center, and but it was never anything that was a result of, big arts grants or anything like that. It's just something that people did. Another example of my community was there was a very active amateur theater troupe. It was called Le Cercle Dramatique de Saint-Paul, and every year they'd put on a big performance of some interesting theatrical work, typically with a focus on French-Canadian theatrical work, whether it was Gratien Gelina or Marcel Dubé or these other great Canadian playwrights. That's the kind of thing they would focus on. But again, people just did it because they loved to do it.
Right.
Same was true of folk dancing or choir or music or bands. I think it was a fairly active community. Not having grown up in other smaller communities, I suppose other ones might have been similar.
Yeah.
It's impossible to say, I suppose, but I know that there was a certain amount of interaction with the other cultures too. When I think about the Ukrainian folk dancing group that was there, and some of the things that we would experience, even going to some of the various Indian reservations, and take part in a powwow, for example, was always something fun and interesting to do.
So how did you end up, this kid from small town Alberta? How did you end up in Toronto?
So it was a bit of a tortuous route in the sense that I ended up going to school in Ottawa as a House of Commons page when I was 18 years old. And that was sort of an interesting, eye-opening experience for me.
Why did you decide to do it?
It was just, I'd had some discussions with a guidance counselor at my high school. He said, this might be an interesting program for you. Do you want to have a look at it? And I remember discussing with my father. He said, that probably, I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do with my life when I was 18.
Most 18-year-olds.
I suppose like most 18-year-olds. And so I decided to do this. It sounded like something a little bit different and interesting.
Right.
In high school, I'd already been very involved in a lot of, I call it quasi-political kinds of things,
right.
More with the United Nations focus. I got involved with a group that was focused on doing model UNs and discussing development issues and those kinds of things.
Right.
And I thought this was kind of an interesting thing to pursue. So I was taking a general program of studies at the University of Ottawa and working as a Commons page on the side. And then I ended up transferring to the University of Alberta, where I pursued an engineering degree, studied for a while at the University of Montreal and the École Polytechnique de Montréal also, but graduated from the University of Alberta, and then worked as a consulting engineer for a couple of years, worked with a focus on urban planning and transportation planning. But I really owed it to myself to pursue some further studies, and so it was a question of did I want to pursue a career more in engineering or something I was actually more interested in, even as an undergraduate, was the world of business. So I did an MBA at the University of Western Ontario, and I started out after graduating from there working with a consulting firm in France. It was an American.
Holy Dinah, you like to travel.
Well,
You've been all over.
I went where the opportunities were.
Sure,
It was
but most people don't go. Not many people get to experience that much of Canada in their whole lives.
I suppose, yeah. I mean, I didn't really travel much as a kid, so maybe I was making up for some lost time. Yeah, and so I was working as a business consultant in France, and then I had a desire to come back to closer to home, and it was an American firm, and it was we had no offices, so you could live anywhere you wanted to as long as it was close to a major airport.
Right.
And
that's a pretty good job.
So I decided to move. Well, yes and no. It's the challenge there is being able to maintain relationships, whether it's
with one person,
family or with one person, for example. Yeah. And so I decided to live in Toronto.
Yeah.
And but then every week I'd find myself on an airplane going somewhere around North America, and that was okay for a while. But again, I guess maybe this gets back to my small town roots, that I really wanted to have something that was more rooted in the community. And so I ended up taking a different job. I can tell you the whole career path, but I was working with Canadian Pacific for a while as an internal consultant. But again, I was traveling mostly every week. But I was a bit more rooted close to home. So that's how I ended up in Toronto.
Was it when your kids arrived that you decided that you were going to try and settle a little bit more? Yeah,
that's a good way to describe it. So for about 8 years, I was basically traveling a lot, which was okay. After I met my lovely wife and we got married, and I was on the road most of the time.
Yeah.
And then I was working on a project, and then my son was born in March of 2000, and I'd been working in Chicago for about 6 months, and it was just a little challenging on the home front without that partner to help, change diapers and do all those kinds of things.
Or wake up in the middle of the night 4 or 5 times.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, you probably know what that's like.
Yeah. So your wife was probably not.
Yeah, so
super thrilled with the arrangement.
She was strongly encouraging me to look at other opportunities that didn't involve so much travel, and I was actually personally very interested in doing something that didn't involve so much travel also. And so I ended up taking a different role with part of the management team of a manufacturing company in Toronto.
I would love to see your resume. It must be about 45 pages long.
Well, I just give people the executive summary version. Yeah, but so I ended up.
You're versatile.
It was interesting experience working in a number of different industries. Recently I tended to focus on retail and consumer products. That was a conscious decision of mine because when I looked at a business consulting career and what are the main industries located in Toronto, so there's banking and there's retail and consumer products. Those are, and so I said, and banking I just found less interesting than the retail and consumer product side of things. So I tended to focus on that in the last 8 years or so. But before that, I worked in mining and pulp and paper and steel and chemicals and railroads, and tended to be more these bigger, heavy industries.
Do you get bored easily?
I suppose one could say that. I guess I guess a more positive word rather than the word bored is I tend to have a curiosity and I'd say a certain fearlessness when it comes to here's a problem. What's sort of the information that I would need to gather to test certain hypotheses I have about the problem. It's sort of a problem-solving business consulting kind of approach. And so actually, once you get into it, you almost want to move on to the next problem. And I wouldn't call it boredom. Yeah. And so in a way, this lifestyle that I've got now is similar, except that the cycle time for these problems, instead of being spending the 4 months or next 6 months solving a certain problem, it's basically daily. That's one of the things that's really interesting is that today this is the problem we're looking at. Tomorrow it's a different set of problems.
Give me a sense of what it was like for you to walk back into the House of Commons as a full-fledged adult, having already had a professional career. You weren't a page anymore. You were an adult. You were there as an MP. What was that like?
It was. I guess I didn't have any kind of overwhelming sense of awe. Because having spent a year in the place, it felt like kind of a normal place to hang out in. It was more for me the focus was more the people and not so much the place. Just interacting with this group of caucus mates, other ministers, and being their peer was what I found interesting. Also, I have good relationships, I'd say, with many members of the opposition too, who are just good people. And so we tend to talk less about politics and more just things on the personal.
So you can actually have nonpartisan friendships and
absolutely, and I've gotten to know a number of my colleagues on a personal level. So we'll have conversations about their interests or their family, hockey, for example, some jibes about their teams or where they're from. One of the things, as somebody who's lived in different parts of the country and then traveled extensively across the country, I often know things about their part of the country that will surprise them. So for example, I've got my wife's family lives in New Brunswick, so I tend to do lots of visits to the Maritimes, and so I'll know things about that part of the country. And then having lived in Quebec and being francophone, I'll bring up just topics of interest to some of my Quebec caucus mates. And then, of course, being from Toronto with my roots in Western Canada, I tend to surprise some people with my knowledge of the country. But anyway, it's always fun and interesting that way.
I really appreciate that you would take the time to be here today. It's been a pleasure to get to know you a bit better.
I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
After repeated rounds of friendly fire,
my record speaks for itself. And if anyone like yourself wants to run against my record, you go ahead. Will you withdraw that caricature and make it clear that we, as New Democrats, are ready to govern?
It's still anyone's game. As the NDP count down to their upcoming convention, from Montreal, it's building a strong, united Canada. The penultimate NDP leadership debate. See it on CPAC.
We're in an unprecedented situation.
Canada should be a leader. We used to be a leader.
Frankly, I think what they're doing is a disgrace.
For those who like a second opinion. Scrums. See it on CPAC. Politics.